All right, this will be a video about five more 1980s movies and the real life conspiracy theories or mysteries that they're based on. If you follow my channel, you know I've already done two compilation videos about some 1970s movies, done some videos about some other 1980s movies. Now I'm moving on to five more 1980s movies, and this video, like with the other ones, will focus on the real life mysteries or the real life conspiracies that these movies are based on because the real life story is usually 100 million times crazier than the actual movies. So we'll get into it. And first up is the Philadelphia experiment from 1984. And in this movie, the US Navy is attempting an experiment in 1943 where they're trying to make a warship invisible to radar, only the experiment causes the ship to disappear completely. And two of the people who are on the ship are transported back to 1984, where they try to figure out what has happened and try to get back to 1943 somehow. And this movie is based on an experiment named the Philadelphia experiment, which allegedly, at least, was a real experiment. So, just like the movie, the supposed true story of the Philadelphia experiment is that the US Navy was attempting an experiment in 1943 to make a warship invisible to radar, and this caused the ship to disappear completely. It vanished from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, then teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, then quickly vanished and reappeared back in Philadelphia. And the experiment was basically a total disaster because some of the crew members were insane when they reappeared, their minds were scrambled, some of the people on board never reappeared at all, and there were even reports of crew members who were fused into the metal hull of the ship when it reappeared, so they were basically merged with the ship. And the backstory of how this all came to be revealed is interesting. It has to do with this man, Morris Jessup, who had a master's degree in astrophysics, and he was big into researching UFOs. In 1955, he wrote a book called The Case for the UFO, which is considered just a really groundbreaking book about UFOs. He speculated that UFOs utilized the Earth's gravitational field as a source of energy, and they used anti gravity technology to fly. And he also talked of UFOs and anti gravity technology being used to build the pyramids centuries ago. Today, you see a lot of things about ancient aliens, and Morris Jessup was the first person to propose this concept in his book 70 years ago. So, Morris Jessup talked about a lot of really advanced things like that, and he got a letter in the mail from someone who'd read his book named Carlos Allende, who was seemingly very knowledgeable about anti gravity and UFOs. And Carlos Allende talked about witnessing an invincibility project that the Navy had performed back in 1943 in Philadelphia, where an entire ship had vanished. And this was where the legend of the Philadelphia experiment started. Morris Jessup continued exchanging letters with Carlos Allende, and Morris Jessup was eventually invited by the Office of Naval Research to come in for an interview. When he arrived, he was given a copy of his book that had been marked up with a bunch of notes from people who provided a lot more details about the things that he discussed in his book, and there were multiple references to the Philadelphia experiment in these notes. So Morris Jessup believed that he was close to the truth or close to uncovering something just really big with his research. Morris Jessup published a few more books on UFOs. Then the whole thing took a bit of a twist because Morris Jessup got in a really bad car wreck in 1958 and he nearly died. And then a short while after that, on April 20th, 1959, he committed suicide by attaching a hose to his car's exhaust pipe and putting the other end in his mouth. So that is either really, really bad luck to have a near fatal car crash and a suicide back to back, or someone wanted Morris Jessup dead. Obviously, there's a pretty strange way to commit suicide, and I actually just did a video about the mysterious Marconi scientist deaths in the 1980s when almost 30 scientists and researchers died off in really gruesome ways. Most of them were ruled suicides, but a lot of people think that these people were being murdered. And some of them died by quote unquote committing suicide by attaching a rubber hose to their car exhaust and putting the other end in their mouth, which was identical to how Morris Jessup died. Another interesting thing is that Morris Jessup was really big into researching anti gravity. At the time, rocket propulsion was the big technology that was being focused on, but Morris Jessup claimed that was just primitive technology compared to anti gravity. And when he gave lectures, he told his audience to petition their politicians to fund anti gravity research because he really believed that was the future. And many of this recent group of scientists who've died mysteriously, that's been all over the news, which I also talked about in my video, a lot of these people were also big into researching anti gravity technology. Now, there is just a ton out there about the Philadelphia experiment, just thousands upon thousands of videos and articles. Most things you see online debunk it or say that it was made up, an urban legend, which obviously could be a possibility. But this book here, The Philadelphia Experiment by William Moore and Charles Berlitz from 1979, this is just an amazing investigation into the Philadelphia experiment. They really go deep into finding people who claim to have witnessed this or have knowledge of it, and they talk about how technology created by Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein might have been linked to this experiment. Charles Berlitz had already written a book about the Bermuda Triangle and done a lot of research into all the ships and planes that have disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. And he speculates that the technology that was tested in the Philadelphia experiment may be the same technology responsible for the Bermuda Triangle disappearances. So it is really fascinating. I may do a full, really long video on the Philadelphia experiment soon here. This book really makes a pretty convincing argument that something happened on that day in the Philadelphia harbor, whether it had to do with invisibility or teleportation or something else. And the next movie on the list is Rambo 3. And in this movie, Rambo's old colonel is putting together a group to help the Mujahideen Afghan rebel group fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but the colonel is captured by the Soviets. So Rambo goes to Afghanistan and teams up with the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets and rescue the colonel. Which this was a real war. The Soviet Union and Afghanistan engaged in a war for pretty much the entire decade of the 1980s, and it wasn't some small war. Some estimates say that around 10% of Afghanistan's total population of 13 million people died during the course of this war, and it was such a long and expensive war for the Soviet Union that this Soviet Afghan war is often cited as one of the main reasons that the Soviet Union collapsed. In the war, the Soviet Union was backing the government of Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen was a very large group of rebel fighters who were trying to overthrow the Afghan government. And it's this Mujahideen group that Rambo teams up with in the movie. So the whole plot of Rambo 3 has become pretty interesting since it was released because members of the Mujahideen later formed the Taliban after the Soviet-Afghan War. You'll sometimes see things online that say Rambo was fighting with the Taliban in the movie, which obviously would be a pretty incredible thing considering that the Taliban was later partially blamed by the US for the 9/11 attacks, and then the US overthrew the Taliban in 2001. But this claim that Rambo was fighting with the Taliban in the movie is kind of true, kind of not. The Mujahideen that he fights with in the movie, it broke up into different factions after the Soviet-Afghan War, and one of those factions was the Taliban. So not all Mujahideen became Taliban, but many of them did. So it is possible that Rambo was fighting with future Taliban members in this movie. But the Taliban is a little misunderstood, and I have shared this chart in my video that I did about the mystery of Pat Tillman's death, but it is such an incredible chart that I wanted to mention it again here. So, the official story of what happened after the Soviet Afghan War is that the Mujahideen broke into some splinter groups after the Afghan government was overthrown. The Taliban was one of these groups, and then the Taliban eventually became so powerful that they took control of Afghanistan. During this time, Afghanistan became the poppy capital of the world. Poppies are used to make heroin, and poppies were the number one crop of Afghanistan. It was estimated that by the year 2000, 72% of the world's opium supply came from poppies grown in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was just the epicenter of the worldwide heroin trade. But then in July of 2000, the Taliban declared that growing poppies was un-Islamic. They banned poppy farming completely in Afghanistan, and this was called one of the most successful anti-drug campaigns of all time. Poppy farming was reduced by 99% in Afghanistan, and as you can see in this chart here, after the Taliban banned poppy farming in 2000, the output of poppies from Afghanistan just basically disappeared. But then, obviously, in 2001, 9/11 happened. The US claimed that the Taliban was giving refuge to Osama bin Laden. As one of the first acts of the war, the US wiped out the Taliban. And as this chart shows, poppy farming in Afghanistan almost instantly resumed and even increased to much higher levels than before. So, a lot of people think that the Afghanistan war that went on all throughout the first part of the 21st century, the real purpose of the war was to reestablish the source of the drugs that the worldwide drug trade depended on. You can find pictures and articles about US soldiers in Afghanistan patrolling these poppy fields during the war. So, this part of Afghanistan, needless to say, is not shown in Rambo 3. This movie is pretty much just pure anti Soviet propaganda. The movie even has a dedication to the brave people of Afghanistan that shows at the end of the movie, so it's pretty safe to assume that Rambo 3 was not being shown on heavy rotation on cable TV during the whole War on Terror in the early 2000s. And it is also interesting how this Soviet Afghan war that went on all throughout the 1980s, this war is really identical in a lot of ways to the Ukraine Russia war that's currently going on. During the Soviet Afghan War, the United States was just basically writing a blank check to the Mujahideen to supply them with state of the art weapons so the war would drag on and it would bankrupt and cripple the Soviet Union to fight them, which was ultimately the result of the war. As I mentioned, this war is cited as one of the main reasons that the Soviet Union collapsed. And it seems like this is the exact playbook for this current Ukraine Russia conflict. The US is just supplying Ukraine with endless amounts of money and arms, so this war between Russia and Ukraine just drags on and becomes insanely expensive for Russia to continue to fight this war. So there's a lot of parallels between these two wars, and I'm actually kind of shocked that there hasn't been like some recent Rambo type movie where a US super soldier goes to Ukraine to help them fight Russia and win the war. But as far as Rambo 3 goes, it's probably the weakest of the three original Rambo movies. What was actually going on in Afghanistan at the time and what ended up happening after the Soviet Afghan War is a much more interesting story than the actual movie itself. And next up is The Last Starfighter, which is about a teenager named Alex Rogan who's obsessed with playing an 80s arcade game. And after he gets a high score in the game, he's approached by a mysterious man named Centauri, who's the inventor of the game, but later reveals that he's an alien from a distant world. And he recruits Alex Rogan to become a pilot in a war on his home planet. And this movie seems to be inspired, at least in part, by the legend of Polybius, which is a supposed arcade game from back in the 1980s, and this is a really awesome mystery. So, the whole legend of Polybius started in the late 1990s on some internet message board forums when a few people posted about this arcade game they remembered from their childhood named Polybius. And there were posts about how people would get these strange side effects from playing the game: headaches, nausea, nightmares. One person posted about how they became addicted to the game and, for reasons they couldn't explain, attempted suicide after playing it for a long time. The game itself was commonly compared to Tempest with a lot of flashing lights and moving objects and loud noises. Most accounts say that Polybius was only tested in arcades in the Portland, Oregon area, and people posted about these mysterious men in black who would lurk around the cabinet and observe people playing. Sometimes they would service the machine or record data from it. So the legend of Polybius grew, but the big question is, well, did this game actually exist back in the 80s, or is this all made up? And if it did exist, what was the purpose? Some people think it could have been a way to test people for abilities like in The Last Starfighter and identify teenagers with exceptional skills. But the more common explanation is that it was a way to test using arcade games for subliminal messages or behavior modification. Obviously, it is very true that the CIA and the military have been interested in studying how to influence people's minds and even control them. The CIA's MK Ultra program is very well known, where people, mostly college students, were given drugs and then monitored to test the effects. So it's definitely not a stretch to think that Polybius could have been used for something like that. It's also no secret that subliminal messages are hidden just everywhere in movies and TVs. There's a million stories out there about messages hidden in music. And it does make sense that the government or a private company would want to test using subliminal messages in arcade games too, because many people probably don't realize just how big arcades were in the early 1980s. In 1982 alone, the arcade industry grossed $8 billion, which was a higher revenue figure than the movie and music industries combined. So if you were looking for ways to influence teenagers and young adults or drop subliminal messages to them, arcades really would have been the place to focus on. One of the more interesting anonymous posts about Polybius came from a guy who claimed that he helped develop the game and that the flashing lights and loud noises from the game were meant to test the effects of stimulating different parts of people's minds. And he says that he later worked on the Sega CD system, which tried to use an updated version of this same technology. So, like I said, there are just a million videos and articles out there about this Polybius mystery, and almost all of these videos and articles talk about how the CIA or the government was behind Polybius. If the game did exist, it's always the CIA, the government. But I think it makes way more sense that a private company would have tried to develop something like this, maybe as a way to communicate subliminal messages to teenagers through arcade games, because technology like that could have been just a cash cow given how popular arcades were at the time. Around this time, Atari was testing this device named the MindLink that was a headband with sensors that would let people control characters on screen with their minds. So there were private companies testing technology like this. So the Polybius mystery is a real fun mystery to look into about whether this game actually existed or not, and the whole legend of Polybius does have a lot in common with the Last Starfighter's plot. And next up is Uncommon Valor from 1983, which is about an army colonel played by Gene Hackman who assembles a team of commandos to rescue POWs in Vietnam who he claims are still being held as prisoners there years after the war ended. And the whole issue of POWs who'd been left behind in Vietnam was a really big issue in the years and even the decades after the Vietnam War. There were over 2,000 soldiers who were listed as missing in action after we withdrew from Vietnam. So these soldiers just didn't return home and their families had no idea what happened to them. Most of them were presumed dead, but there was talk that some of them were still alive and they were being held in Vietnam POW camps. The government and the military, they always denied that there were still POWs in Vietnam after the war, so many of these missions to search for POWs were done by private citizens and funded privately. I talked about this issue of rescuing POWs in my video on Ross Perot's 1992 presidential campaign because before he ran for president, Ross Perot was just very, very involved in this issue. He paid for multiple teams of former soldiers to go to Vietnam to search for POWs after the war. Some of these missions happened in the mid 1980s, so it was long after the war ended. In Uncommon Valor, their mission is funded by a Texas billionaire named McGregor, who's played by the legend himself, Robert Stack, host of Unsolved Mysteries. This character was almost certainly based on Ross Perot, who was also a Texas billionaire. Ross Perot eventually teamed up with Bo Greitz, who was regarded as possibly the most decorated soldier in the Vietnam War, and he was also very outspoken about the POW issue. He went on multiple private missions back to the Vietnam area to find soldiers that he claimed were still being held there after the war, and many of these missions were funded by Ross Perot. Bogreitz eventually came to believe that the issue of POWs still being held in Vietnam was being mostly ignored by our own government because if a bunch of attention was paid to this region, it could have exposed the drug rings that were still operating in the Vietnam region, which he said some very high up people in the US government were involved in these drug rings. I will say there is some controversy over Bo Greitz and his credibility. His story does kind of seem like one of those stories that's just too good to be true. The most decorated soldier in the Vietnam War, almost like some scripted character. And there is some controversy over whether he did the things that he claimed in Vietnam and won the medals that he claimed that he won. He was labeled as the real life Rambo, and actually, the plot of Rambo 2 also has Rambo returning to Vietnam to rescue POWs that he claims are still over there. Bo Greitz went on to host a radio show that had a huge audience, and he later got involved with various militia groups throughout the U.S. Later on, Bo Greitz was very outspoken that the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 was an inside job. So there's a lot of mystery around Bo Greitz. He never did find any of these POWs that he claimed were still over in Vietnam, but he did get a lot of publicity and attention for these trips and brought a lot of attention to the issue of POWs still being held in Vietnam. This is the exact plot of Uncommon Valor, and the character that Gene Hackman plays in the movie is pretty much an exact copy of Bo Greitz. And then last up is Real Genius from 1985. And in this movie, the CIA hires a college professor to develop an ultra powerful laser. And the professor recruits a few of his best physics students for the project. The students eventually succeed and build the laser. It's so powerful that it can be shot to Earth from space. And the students realize that the laser they build is going to be used as a weapon to cause death and destruction. So they try to destroy the laser before the CIA can use it. So, space lasers play a big part in the plot of Real Genius. The movie came out in 1985, and it was most likely inspired by the Strategic Defense Initiative program, which was also known as the Star Wars program, which was announced in 1983. This was going to be an entire system of lasers and weapons in space that would be used to shoot down any missiles the Soviet Union might launch at us. But from the very start, there was talk that this laser system could be used as an offensive weapon. This article on screen here appeared on the front page of the LA Times all the way back in 1986. Star Wars lasers held able to incinerate cities. The first line reads, laser weapons being developed as part of President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative could more easily be used to incinerate enemy cities than to protect the United States against Soviet missiles, according to an article in the current issue of a leading physics magazine and a separate study being circulated among government weapons scientists. And it says these lasers could be used to unleash massive firestorms, and a weapons expert who was interviewed said there is no question such a device could also be used to create mass fires of enormous scale and ferocity. So this article is pretty mind-blowing. Officially, at least, the Star Wars program was pretty much ended by Bill Clinton shortly after he was elected in 1992. He merged the program with a missile defense research program, and it was claimed that missiles became the focus of the research. But it's pretty hard to believe that a weapon that would be not just an effective defensive weapon, but potentially just the ultimate offensive weapon, that wouldn't be just abandoned by the military. Just recently, in December of 2025, Israel successfully deployed their Iron Beam laser defense system, which is a ground based laser system to destroy incoming missiles, and they're also working on a space based laser weapon system. The defense minister said, "We must be the leading country in the world with this capability," and said that this system will ensure the advantage of deterrence as well as the ability to attack and destroy, since these space lasers will be used as both an offensive and a defensive weapon. So, obviously, it's a pretty scary thought considering that this article from 40 years ago talked about entire cities being able to be destroyed by lasers in space. And by the way, the critical support for Israel's development of this system came from $1 billion of support provided by the USA. So, officially, at least, that satellite based laser system is being developed, but there's a lot of talk of how satellite based lasers already exist. Space lasers were talked about a lot when some really gigantic fires happened a few years ago that were pretty suspicious. In 2018, the Paradise Forest fire just wiped out the entire city of Paradise, California, and there were some really strange photos from this fire. The forest fire just obliterated houses and reduced them to rubble, but there were trees, in some cases just a few feet away from the destroyed houses, that were completely untouched by the forest fire. There were cars with aluminum parts that had melted, which requires just a tremendous amount of heat and energy. There were photos of huge steel beams that were warped by the forest fire. And then in 2013, a massive forest fire happened in Maui, and there were a lot of suspicious things about that forest fire, too. There were homes that were just completely reduced to ash, with nearby structures that were totally untouched by fire. A number of celebrities and tech billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Oprah have mansions in Maui that were untouched by the wildfire, but the nearby homes of the quote unquote commoners were destroyed. There were also some viral TikTok posts showing how blue structures were untouched by the fires, and it was pointed out how lasers can actually target specific colors. This is how tattoo removal with a laser works. One laser can't be used to remove every color. The laser has to be tuned to different wavelengths to break down the different colors. So the whole idea that these forest fires were started by lasers really went viral. There was just a ton of stuff out there. Some of it was honestly really compelling and obviously very scary. It was not surprisingly debunked and ridiculed by a bunch of mainstream articles. They labeled it as outlandish and unrealistic, but this article from 40 years ago was literally talking about this exact same thing. So, Real Genius, definitely an 80s classic, and the whole space based laser that Val Kilmer builds in the movie is really not very far fetched at all. So that's five more 1980s movies and the strange real life conspiracies and mysteries that they're based on. Definitely check out the other videos I've done about some 1970s movies and some other 1980s movies if you haven't seen those videos. It's a real fun thing to look into the real life mysteries and conspiracies that these movies are based on. As I mentioned, the real life stories are usually a million times crazier than the actual movies. Then, lastly, thanks as always to the members here on YouTube and the supporters on Patreon. You guys are awesome, and it really, really means a lot. So thanks again. Truly greatly appreciate the support, and we'll see you soon with another video.